Testing, 1, 2, testing. Testing, 1, 2. If you could please make your way to your seats, we're about to get started. If you could please make your way to your seats, we're about to get started. Thank you. Yeah. All right, if I could have your attention. Welcome to ISI's Kirby campus. It's a pleasure to welcome back so many students, friends, and alumni for our conference this afternoon on the topic of higher education. And we all know we can all feel what is wrong with higher education, but we're going to start with an amazing panel really focusing on what is the purpose of higher education, what are the ends of higher education. From there, we're going to talk about the future of the academy, and we're going to imagine possible futures that might not exist right now, but that could exist with the help of organizations like ISI. And then we're going to conclude by talking about the state of the academy, academic freedom, and some of the conservative defenses and critiques of academic freedom and what that means for our strategies going forward. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague, Claire, who will introduce our first panelist.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Alumni Reunion Conference. We're so glad that you're here at our homecoming weekend. Thank you for bearing with us with the weather. Lord willing, the rain will continue to hold off. Also, I'd like to announce that throughout each of these panels, we will be having interactive options with our app, so you can have access to polls and also have access to ask questions. So I encourage you to use the app to do so. Throughout this academic year, ISI students and faculty have covered a vast array of topics and themes in our conferences, but as a counter university at our homecoming weekend, we want to discuss higher education, just as Johnny had said. What is the current state of the university, particularly as regards academic freedom? What is the future of the university? But before we can get to these topics, we must start with the purpose of the university. How do we remain rooted in the liberal arts tradition? And as conservatives, how do we hold a posture of gratitude for what has come before? How do we encourage the study of the true, the good, and the beautiful? So to help answer these questions, we have assembled a group of true experts in teaching and defending the liberal arts tradition. As good readers, I'd encourage you to read our speakers' full bios in your program. But briefly, to my left, Dr. David Whalen is a professor of English at Hillsdale College, where he has taught since 1994. And as alumni director, I have to mention that he was also an ISI graduate fellow, so he is a great example to alumni in the audience of what we hope you will do in your careers. Further down the line, we have Dr. Susan Hanssen, who is a professor of history at the University of Dallas. And then we have Dr. R.J. Snell, who is the editor-in-chief of Public Discourse and the director of academic programs at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton. So without further ado, let's begin. Dr. Whalen.
Okay, thank you very much. It's customary to say, but it's true that it's a pleasure to be here. That pleasure is for me, however. I don't know about you. You invited an English professor to an event like this. This is called a captive audience, and you're likely to suffer the affliction of poetry. So I am indeed going to subject you to a poem. It's a very short one. I'll probably read it twice. But the poem says some things we'll talk about pertaining to the telos, or end of a liberal education, but perhaps in a somewhat surprising way. This is a poem titled Frescoes in an Old Church by a not very well-known 20th century British poet by the name of Walter de la Mare. 6 centuries now have gone since, one by one, these stones were laid, and in air's vacancy this beauty made. Again, it's frescoes in an old church. They who thus reared them their long rest have won. Ours now this heritage, to guard, preserve, delight in, brood upon, and in these transitory fragments scan the immortal longings in the soul of man. So I'll read that again. 6 centuries now have gone since one by one these stones were laid, and in air's vacancy this beauty made. They who thus reared them, their long rest have won. Ours now this heritage, to guard, preserve, delight in, brood upon, and in these transitory fragments scan the immortal longings in the soul of man. Now, one could be pardoned for thinking that this short little verse is a quaint, charming, perhaps sentimental tribute to the aesthetic self-indulgence in a cobwebbed and irrelevant museum piece from the past. One could be pardoned, except for the last two lines. And in these transitory fragments, scan the immortal longings in the soul of man. Scan is an active verb, a present verb. It means current, present possession. Also, this poem was written well before the digital age, so scan doesn't quite mean here in the poem what it might mean to us. Etymologically, scan actually means to climb, to mount, to rise, okay? Think of that. So, and now in these transitory fragments, scan the immortal longings in the soul of man. The longings are not past, are not dead, are not cobwebbed or shrouded in a kind of nostalgic, sentimental appeal of things gone past. The longings are immortal. They perdure. They are intransigent in our natures. They do not pass. They are present permanently and urgent permanently, okay? So in one way, this poem represents or actually more than one facet of liberal education. But liberal education itself, the telos of a liberal education, addresses or answers to at least a set of the immortal longings alluded to in this poem. In other words, it's an answer to human nature. Liberal arts education is not primarily an institutional structure or some kind of historical accumulated accident. The telos of liberal education, in fact, can be stated very simply. It can be stated in really just 2 or 3 sentences. That doesn't mean doing it is simple. That doesn't mean the education itself is simple. But it can be described or defined teleologically fairly simply. Unlike Victor Davis Hanssen, I have notes. So I will use them. So what is that telos? Unlike goldfish, parakeets, or cats, human beings have to learn to see reality. We do not do it automatically. And we have to learn to see, and by extension then, to enter into an at least partial understanding of reality. This is something learned over time with difficulty. I think it was Walker Percy who used to say, we are remarkably dense. Of all the creatures in the world, we are the slowest to learn. So by learning to see reality, we actually enter into the fullness of our own nature. That's why I said liberal education answers to something permanent, perduring, hardwired, if you want to employ the digital language, into human nature. By that learning, again, we enter into the fullness, or we become more fully human, more fully humane, and do so in receipt of a history or of a tradition of scans of the immortal longings of the soul of man. So it's those 3 things. Learning to see reality. The object of a liberal education is to acquire the habit, what Newman called a philosophic habit of mind, which is that learning to see what is real and to enter into an at least partial understanding, to thereby fulfill, complete, or at least grow, develop one's own very humanity, and in so doing, receive or carry forward the human civilized history of the meditations on the immortal longings of the soul of man. So as I say, it's not hard to conceptualize, it's not hard to define, it's extremely hard to do. So another famous passage, literary passage, where this is seen as well, is in the oft-quoted, sometimes misquoted, but the oft-quoted remark of Pindar in his second Pythian ode. He says, "Be what you are, now that I have told you what that is." Okay, that's liberal education. Be what you are, now that I have told you what that is. So the philosophic habit of mind, I mentioned already. That's that susceptibility to reality, which has to be learned. Secondly, a continuing and perduring susceptibility to wonder. Wonder is this is both the end and a means. It's both a means and an end in liberal education. Wonder is that species of fear that it's a species of fear, frankly, of our own ignorance. Now, it's a pleasurable fear. It's one of the few kinds of fear that is actually desirable, that human beings naturally enjoy. But it's that fear of our own ignorance without which we acquire zero wisdom, neither poetry nor philosophy. So, philosophic habit of mind, enduring susceptibility to wonder, rightly ordered loves, because disordered desire disorders intellect, not just the will. And then that history, that tradition that I mentioned of those scannings of the immortal longings in the heart of man, sometimes is called a cultural patrimony, sometimes it is called a heritage, or the best that has been thought or said. I think that was mentioned last night. And lastly, not least important, but lastly, the telos entails what Newman also refers to, quaintly perhaps, at least to us it might sound quaint, as a gentleman, or more properly, it entails the gentling of the human condition, which gentling is an acquisition of a kind of mature, quote-unquote, aristocratic self-governance that allows one to enter into one's own full citizenship. Okay, those are that last one bleeds over properly into the social telos of a liberal education, and for that I will conclude simply by reading this passage, short passage from Newman. He says, "A university, liberal education, training is the great ordinary means to a great but ordinary end. It aims at raising the intellectual tone of society, at cultivating the public mind, at purifying the national taste, at supplying true principles to popular enthusiasm and fixed aims to popular aspiration, at giving enlargement and sobriety to the ideas of the age, at facilitating the exercise of political power and refining the intercourse of private life." So that's the social entailment predicated upon the personal endowments I articulated just a moment ago.
We were asked to talk about the telos of the university, which means that we get to put forward an ideal. Right? And then the next two panels will look at the hard realities of the state of the university and the future of the university. So before moving on to that rather more painful work, we have the pleasure of contemplating the Platonic form of the university. Whenever you use the word telos, it elicits this ability to just think of the ideal form of the university. And I wanted to just particularly talk about 2 points. The first is that, and I think this goes back to the philosophic mind, the university is for the creation of an interior disposition of attention and reverence, observation of nature, with the assumption that we can know the natures of things if we attend to them closely enough. And the opposite of that interior disposition, and I think it is interesting for us as we talk to kind of have a little bit of an examination of conscience, a little bit of a sense of self-knowledge. Am I, or did I, over the course of my 4 years at a university, acquire an interior disposition of attentiveness to the natures of things, greater awareness of the nature of things, and a reverence for them, a desire to foster things becoming what they are, whether it's the human becoming what it is, right, or a good society becoming what it is, the family becoming what it is, right, to know what it is, right, in order to help it to become freely what it is intended to be. The opposite of that disposition is an assumption that the world out there is not made up of natures, the world out there is not formed. The world out there is a chaos of crashing atoms that is awaiting my making, and that I approach it with a spirit of domination and control. Right? So it's the exact opposite of the disposition that the university is trying to foster ought to be trying to foster in the human person. Henry Adams, the last of the Adamses, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Charles Francis Adams, good old Henry Adams. Henry Adams describes these two dispositions of the soul as the virgin and the dynamo. The virgin is the contemplative disposition, and the dynamo is the disposition of all technology, right? The approach to reality as I'm going to technologize this into serving my own purposes, as opposed to the virgin, which is contemplating and trying to understand the inner purposes of the nature of the thing. And I think well, we don't want to go into the current state of the university, but I think there is a tendency to want all students to come forth at graduation as change agents, right? And I think a change agent has the inner dynamo as their inner disposition, as opposed to the virgin, the contemplative. So that's the first point that I wanted to make, this contrast between the virgin and the dynamo, between an inner disposition of contemplation and reverence for the nature of things, or an assumption that there is no such thing as the nature of man or the nature of woman or the nature of the human person that we can discern, and that it's all available to our making, to our technological making. The second point that I wanted to make, I think, speaks to the idea of a cultural heritage. When I went to college, I thought that I was already pretty well educated, pretty well formed by a good family and a good secondary education. I was well formed in philosophical first principles. I had my political principles, I had my religious principles, I had my moral principles, and I felt that there was really no need to look for a university that would educate me, that would truly be an alma mater, a nourishing, educating mother. I thought that I could go to a big, diverse, international, urban campus university, or an Ivy League university, where I could essentially be a missionary rather than a student. That I would be a missionary for the first principles that I had learned elsewhere at this institution. I wasn't going to the institution in order to be a student, right? So I thought that at age 18, I was ready, right? And I fought my way through Boston University with the help of the College Republicans and an ISI chapter and pro-life club that we founded with 3 people out of the 26,000 undergraduates that there were at Boston University. And I always assumed that I would become one of the lone Christian conservatives at a big secular research university like Boston University. But God had other plans, and providentially I got a job at the University of Dallas, a small Christian liberal arts college. And what I have discovered over the past 20 years, a little bit of a more mature vision of education, over the past 20 years teaching at the University of Dallas, is that the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian tradition has, in the words of Edmund Burke, clothed our first principles with ideas taken from the wardrobe of a moral imagination. And that as an 18-year-old with clear first principles, whether they were political first principles or moral first principles, I still was uneducated in all of the treasures of the Western heritage. And to be a young patriot, but to never have thought about Pius Aeneas or Bernini's Aeneas fleeing Troy with Anchises on his shoulders, on his broad shoulders, and his son Ascanius trailing behind at his heels, is to be an impoverished conservative, is to have first principles with no cultural heritage. And so I think that that's a very valuable part of a university education, is that we have imagination when we're young. We start to love logic and logic chopping and first principles in our teenage years, but we need to come back around to imagination, to poetry, to art, to architecture, and to cultural memory during the university years in order to come into a mature possession of that wardrobe of moral imagination. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you. Good to be back at ISI's beautiful campus. Congratulations on a lovely event. Delighted to be sharing a stage with two scholars and teachers I've admired and respected for so long. Although I will admit, when they announced that there would be live polling on the apps going on, I had a moment of panic as they plunged just about now. So I hope you enjoyed the first two speakers anyway. Every institution presupposes some sort of anthropology. Institutions exist because humans exist. And institutions exist because they're trying to take human beings from one state of affairs or one set of conditions to another. Oftentimes the anthropology or vision of the human being is hidden, implicit, not made known, and sometimes it's explicit itself. The university is no different. And of course, when you have an anthropology or a vision of the human being and what the human being is for, institutions will reward those who are most able or most adept at the anthropology which is being presupposed by that institution. And I'd suggest for your consideration that the university has, for a long time now, had an anthropology which views human beings as primarily, if not solely, thinking things, or things which think. So the university in its current mode values knowledge production, it values cleverness, it values analysis, it values logic, it values discovery, it values mathematics and these sorts of things. And you won't find for me any hesitation about praising the vision of the human being as a rational animal. But of course, Aristotle's sense of the rational animal is not remotely the same thing as the thinking thing. For Aristotle, the rational animal is also the social animal, the embedded animal, the political animal, one who can't survive or thrive without others. That's far different from the thinking thing that you would find in someone like René Descartes or Humboldt's vision of the university, which I think suffers from three major pathologies. Susan was much more disciplined than me. She said she wasn't going to go to the critique, but I'm an academic. That's all I really know how to do is complain and demand better parking. I think the first pathology of thinking things is that it's prone to a certain kind of Gnosticism. If we're thinking things, we're not necessarily embodied things. Those can be sort of discarded. Community is irrelevant. The history of a place is irrelevant. Something that I often do with students is ask them to name me 5 species of trees on their campus, and they can't simply say oak and evergreen because they know those exist somewhere around. Or to list the species of birds, or to tell me the history of the town that their college is from. They don't know. Why would they? They're here to learn how to think. And when you're disembodied and ahistorical, it's easy then, I think, to get to the second pathology of the contemporary university, dominated by the thinking thing, which is rationalism. Rationalism, I think, has been well defined by Michael Oakeshott in his little essay on that as people with plans, people with projects, people who assume that because they have a certain form of education, a 5-year plan and a white paper can, in fact, fix things. It's history which is in the way. It's culture which is in the way. It's those slow, retrograde people who are tied to place and time and family who are in the way. A plan can fix things, and a plan can fix almost anything. You see this in the contemporary academy, right? Sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And it won't work in practice after we're done theorizing about it, let me tell you what. But on paper, it's great. The rationalist has no humility. The rationalist does not know that the plan works with the crooked timber of humanity and never works out quite as they fear. We used to joke in conservative circles that nothing was worse than, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. Now I think it is, I'm here with a plan and I'm here to help. That's the thinking thing's temptation. The third pathology, I think, that follows from that is a sense of domination. Oddly, the thinking thing in the end believes that their will, their choice, their freedom, their liberty is untethered from the past, untethered from limits, untethered from piety, from humility, from respect. And so the contemporary university becomes a place where we learn to destroy, to no longer believe, to be too clever to believe, immunized from belief and piety and humility. And in the end, our freedom runs amok, and we destroy the things which are dear and small and little, where most of us find well-being and joy and human flourishing. We're not thinking things. I think what we are, first and foremost, is lovers. We're the sort of being for whom the world matters. You can know what a person is, who they are, by what they value. Don't tell me their theories. Tell me what they love, what they care about, the things that are on their mind and in their plans. A better anthropology is that we are loving beings or caring beings. And a caring being and the institutions which provide for and care for those caring beings is the sort of institution which knows that we do not define human well-being merely by our pocketbook or by how clever we are or how quickly we think. We define a flourishing human being by the level of their responsibility. How responsibly do they exercise their freedom? How responsibly do they exercise care for others, for the place they've been given? Now, I think the liberal arts exist then to form our loves, to form our values, to form us into our own responsible action and responsible freedom. And I think the master who's articulated this never has been surpassed, and I think will never be surpassed, remains Plato in the Republic. I think everyone reads this famous sun, line, and cave as if they're about metaphysics, but they're really about a pattern of education, he tells us. We begin in ignorance and we love our ignorance. There's a lovely scene of the prisoners chained in the bottom of the cave where they give each other prizes for their ability to predict what's going on in the shadow worlds. You can get tenure predicting what's going on in the shadow worlds. The poll went up just now. I've won. Take that, Susan. And if you are a master of the shadows, you become university president. There is a remarkable scene in the Republic where the philosopher enters down into the cave and helps the prisoner, the student, all of us, turn, convert, change the object of their affection, the object of their thought, the things that they value, and realize that they weren't the really real, and begin the slow, painful, sometimes tortuous ascent up the cave into the light of the world of things which are actually lovely, lovable, and real. I think the liberal arts exist to help us to love better than we do and to love things which are really worth loving. And I think the liberal arts are basically the form of helping us wonder, where we move from our complacent self-satisfaction to the acknowledgement that we do not know. Socrates knows this well. The early Socratic dialogues are not unsurpassed in this. I do not know and I wish to know, to wonder. And from wonder to understanding. I think understanding is the intellectual operation which is most ignored in the contemporary university. We wish to get to judgment, but first one must understand, and there is a long apprenticeship of getting to understand. And from understanding to responsibility. At the end of the day, we are in fact rational beings, but rational beings have wills. The will is simply the intellectual appetite. And so we then have to choose and act, and we have to choose and act with grave responsibility. Often we have to choose and act before we fully understand. Every parent knows this. You have to engage the child, help the child, instruct the child without yet understanding the child. That's the grave risk of education. We judge and choose before we fully understand. Now, I'm convinced that conservatives need to be incredibly flexible about the contemporary university. We are non-ideological. We are people of principle who then act in the world as it is, not in the world as we wish it was. That's the rationalist. Not in the world as it used to be. Teachers, patrons, donors, trustees of universities are responsible for the care of students as they are. And many students arrive at university without pathways of wisdom. They do not know how to responsibly exercise their freedom. They've been taught how to succeed, how to advance, how to move along, not how to be free in a responsible way. And I think we must first understand that the students that we deal with, the universities that we deal with, we have young men and women begging for traditions of wisdom, begging for access to the truth, not so they can win contests of sort of Jeopardy-like levels of I know things. They want to know how to live. They want to lead worthwhile lives, worthy lives, and they're begging us to provide them the traditions and pathways so they can be responsible in their freedom. There will be, of course, some universities and colleges who know how to do this. Hillsdale, UD knows how to do this. I think we have to admit that most of the contemporary research universities no longer know nor care to do this. They're uninterested in forming the loves of their students, or if they are, they're the wrong loves. And they require us to be like those in Prague as the Soviet tanks come in, where you switch the signs so they go the wrong direction. There will be programs like humanities at Villanova, Mark Schiffman's here, who will be able to help young people form their loves. And there will be a professor here and there that we can build things around to help people, young students, form their loves. And there's going to be an awful lot of work by organizations like ISI doing a parallel university, accompanying young men and women who have in some ways been abandoned by their schools and been abandoned by their universities, and who need people to come along beside them and remind them that they have a soul and there is more to life than success and more to life than cunning. And at the end of the day, they will be judged at the end by how well they loved and how responsibly they act in keeping with those loves.
So thank you very much to our speakers for those insightful remarks. As you are entering your questions into the ISI app, I have a question for you all. So can small c conservatives make the liberal arts great again? And by that, I specifically want to ask about literature, art, and music, and if possible, how do we go about that?
To whom?
Anyone who'd like to answer.
Well, the short answer, I guess, is yes. Again, these things all answer to human nature. It's not going away. They're not evaporating. They can be battered and bruised, but they're not going to disappear. So the question then becomes, and I don't mean to be reductive or simplistic, the question then becomes, how does one go about responding to one's own desire for love of beauty, love of wisdom? How do you go about doing that? And I think you've already heard a little bit in answer to that. You find the faculty who still are capable of wonder and still are wonder. Again, I fear the sentimental associations that we often bring to really important terms and what they represent, things like wonder or like love. But you find the faculty who still respond, who are still susceptible to wonder. You find those institutions like ISI and others that prompt and promote those very things. And you, insofar as you can and have the latitude to do so, you organize yourself and your life in ways that cultivate and blossom in the face of these as you said, the literature, the philosophy, the poetry, the history, these things that respond or are a response to our own native longings.
I don't really have anything to add. We're getting into the future of the university, talking about how, is it possible for there to be a revival? And that's an enormous question. I do think that in America we still have a lot of resources. There's an enormous homeschool movement, charter school movement, private school movement, parochial school movement that is still outside of the bounds of state control. And even in the past year, we've seen enormous strides taken by parents in terms of trying to recapture local school boards. We have the ability to start 501c3 non-for-profit organizations that can devote themselves to education. And so we really are a country that still has the freedom to create a liberal arts revival, a classical education revival, I think more so than almost any of the other countries around us.
As I get old, I become more optimistic, which I think is backwards for the way it's supposed to go. You're supposed to become wise and hard-headed, and I've become more and more optimistic. Things are so bad, they have to get better. I actually think things are going to be fine for the liberal arts for the following reason. For a long time, our culture despisers have ignored the texts. They've been busy with everything else other than the texts. So many of the students arrive at university not having had their experience of the text perverted by theory already. Because they haven't read these books before. They've never heard these works of music. They've never seen these works of art. So the question, can small c conservatives make the liberal arts great again? In some ways, I would say this. Yes, if we bracket the small c conservative and leave that far to the side, and have no ideological vision for the reading of the text or the listening of the music at all, and simply allow students to feast on the great works. They don't need my intervention. I know this is one of the great disappointments to academics like myself. I mean, we're all very clever people, us academics. Just ask us. I've been working on something. You know, this is where my in-laws sort of immediately veer for the cocktail lounge. The students do not need my intervention between their intellects and the text. They need the text.
All right, thank you. I will now move to some questions from the app. For students who attend universities without a classical core curriculum, how do you recommend rectifying this malnutrition of their intellectual and personal development?
So I feel like I've already talked about this in my lunchtime talk, so I'll just reiterate what I said there, which is that Russell Kirk's Roots of the American Order, if you read that book and then read the primary sources that he references in that book, that is it's a cheat sheet. It's a 600-page cheat sheet, 600-page cheat sheet to the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian tradition. But also Sir Kenneth Clarke's Civilization series, which is 45 minutes each episode. It's like listening to a poem just before going to bed. Just watch a 45-minute episode and then become obsessed with the works of art, musical art, architectural art, painting, sculpture that he brings up in each of those episodes. That's a way to recover some sense of the richer tradition.
I didn't used to be convinced, and I've become increasingly convinced by John Sr.'s claim that most students are in fact not ready for the great books. That our imaginations and educations have become so impoverished that to be handed a great book is to not know what to do with it just yet. And so if one's sort of getting ready, I think the big axis point is the pretty good books. That's what Senior calls them, the good books. Or Charlotte Mason, someone that my own family is indebted to, calls the living books. Peter Rabbit is actually a pretty good starting place. Wind in the Willows is a pretty good starting place. The text that one might not be ready to read, you know, sort of, I certainly wasn't ready to read the Aeneid until I was 48, and I'm 46 now. The good books form us in a transition of what we are to believe. If liberal arts are to help us to believe as opposed to putting up barriers to belief, right? Not taking apart, deconstructing, destroying, but helping us to get a taste for the believable, the real, the way to prepare is to read the good books, the living books, the pretty good books.
I might add that if the question is, how does one compensate for the absence of a guiding core curriculum, the answer is going to depend very much on the practical realities on the ground of the institution where you find yourself. But one old and seasoned piece of advice that's pretty good is find a faculty member, especially someone who's been at that institution for a while, who, again, is not intellectually and morally dead, but alive, alert, and keenly in love with the tradition and with learning. Find that person. There's almost always at least a handful, and that person will guide you and direct you to the other faculty at that institution and what they teach, and can begin to compensate for the absence of a core.
All right, so I think we will open up a mic for questions, and as you guys are lining up, I want us to consider the Matthew Arnold quote about the education being the best that's thought and said. Is that something that each generation can help define, or is it something universal to all time and people?
So let's do the canon battles right here in front of
Yes.
everyone. I'm more skeptical of that quote than I used to be. I used to be quite enamored with it, and I'm less so now. I think it risks betraying a certain ideological woodenness, and we need to find and embrace what's good as it can be accessed by those who are looking for the good.
The thing I would say in defense, I don't often cite that passage myself. Arnold makes that observation in placing culture as a kind of reverend entity in lieu of religion. So, you know, I have my own reasons to be skeptical of the passage, but in its defense, it presupposes that there is a hierarchy of excellence that can be known, that can be recognized, and that excellence is deserving of the veneration and the perpetuation that attaches to human achievements at the highest level. So, you know, a nod in that direction. But if the question is the best that has been thought and said, is a high intellectual, artistic, literary, philosophical achievement something that can be perpetuated, or is it augment? The answer is obviously going to be a both. You know, you do adjust and modify and add the whole great books tradition. Heck, the good books tradition, for that matter, is assimilative, and so it's not an either or. You really do both.
It seems to me that there is something to be said for the best that has been said and written, because if we don't know the various melodies from earlier in our tradition, we don't see how the later players are playing with those melodies. And if someone hasn't read Augustine's Confessions and Book 10 on memory, then when one picks up Brideshead Revisited, one won't see what a Augustinian memory-drenched text it is. And so we become better readers the more of our own tradition we know, because we can catch allusions, we can hear echoes, we can see how a certain theme has been played with in counterpoint by a later work of art. And so there is definitely something very enriching about knowing the fullness of the tradition. Yeah, leave it at that.
Thank you. All right, let's open up to the audience for questions. Gentleman in the front. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Mihal, go ahead.
When I think about renewal in education, there's something in the zeitgeist that says that it would be really bad if we were to be proud of our cultural traditions, of the best that's been taught and said. And it seems like the hermeneutics of distrust isn't quite right either. But what is right in the criticism, especially in the sort of experience of 20th century totalitarianism? What's right in the direction of jingoism? And then what's the actual sort of response to the corresponding excess?
I think we can't be naive. I think conservatives are flexible people. We believe in principles, not just in a set of policies which everyone needs to follow. We can admit the errors and weaknesses of a people while still having a loyalty and a love for those people. It seems to me that when we're dealing with education, we have to deal with students as they are. We're trying to have persons. The person is the only thing in all of creation which is created for its own sake. We're trying to have persons become alive, persons become genuine centers of value and responsible choice. When we engage with a student, we offer them a feast of text and thought and argument. Some are ready only for the snack, right, the sort of sugary drink part of it. Some are ready for the full entree. Some are ready for the full meal and the dessert and the wine courses which go along with that. At the moment, people have been trained to distrust and distrust, right, to have the hermeneutic of suspicion. Prior, I think, to having them embrace the entirety of the tradition and to be able to overcome their objections to it, they first have to learn to love something about the text. Just a dessert, perhaps. So my own answer to that would be is we deal with students as they are, and we provide the most access that we can to them by providing the texts, staying out of the way, and allowing them to articulate their distrust, their loathing, their suspicion based on the tradition and so on, because that's where they are as a person, and I have no right to suggest that where they are as a person is not how they are.
It seems to me that, so you're asking about where we should be on sort of the spectrum of pride in our cultural tradition and a sense of distrust of all canons. And I think that anyone who has been immersed in a truly liberal education has a pride, a good pride, the way we would talk about a kind of family pride, which is not a personal pride in that tradition. I think it would be absurd for anyone to say, like, well, I've read Dante. Right. Oh, really? Right? You know, I mean, I know the Adorate Devote by heart in Latin. Would I say I know the Adorate Devote? I mean, the kinds of things that we refer to as the best that have been thought or said, right? These great works of art are unplumbable by a single individual. And so while we wouldn't have a personal pride in them as a possession, right? We nevertheless have a sense of wonder, wondering pride, I suppose, the way one might. I think there's a certain family pride that is appropriate. It's a kind of, well, it's pietas, it's reverence rather than pride in the bad sense of the word. And I think that that's very appropriate because without that, we don't take the time to actually read. when we think of something as our possession, as something that many generations have tried to plumb this in the past, and now is my turn to try, right? We might actually devote the time to sit down and do some reading, right? But if nothing comes to us with that inherited sense of importance, we may never set aside, we may never pour out the libation of our time to actually invest in trying to squeeze some of the juice out of it. I feel like I'm using a bunch of mixed metaphors, but anyway.
David, do you respond?
That's a very big subject. It's a really big subject, and that's a terrible temptation for an academic. So to be extremely brief, the worst advocates of the tradition, the greatest harm done in continuing the tradition is almost always done by its advocates, done by poor servants, people who do more harm than good despite their intentions. And so I re-echo the whole point about humility and veneration and service rather than a sense of ownership, mastery, and even worse, salesmanship. However, without suggesting that the Western tradition is a kind of formless soup of impossibly clashing claims, it is true that the tradition is a glorious mess and a continuous argument and a rousing chorus of contesting voices, not to say there aren't harmonies, not to say there aren't congruences and consistencies, not to deny that. But what is often called the tradition is not a monolithic, simple entity. It's interesting that the people who want to destroy and banish and annihilate the tradition treat it precisely as if it's this monolithic, unitary thing that isn't a mess. The tradition is like, if I can be crude and pick up on part of a mixed metaphor, it's like a gumbo. It's delicious and outrageous and impossibly good, and it's a mess. You know, it's just a glorious mess. And people who think of it as this monolithic creedal set of historically arranged propositions don't really understand that, yes, there are harmonies and consistencies, and we do well to contemplate them. But for crying out loud, the first thing to know about the tradition is that it can't be owned or mastered. It owns and masters you.
All right, we have a question from the app from one of our alumni and young faculty members. So policymakers are pushing greater access to higher ed to open greater economic opportunities to all Americans by providing free community college, for instance. Should everyone be exposed to a liberal arts higher education, or is education in the classics of the Western tradition for an elite people with characters capable of grasping such truths? Stated another way, given our shared humanity with its telos, should universal higher education be a goal?
I'm going to say yes, in some way everyone should be exposed to a liberal education. I don't know at what level. I think it's possible to have a liberal education at the elementary school level, at the high school level, at the university level. But I think that it is something, right, with our universal human nature and its universal telos that everyone should be given. And I say this particularly thinking of Joseph Pieper's book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, that no one should ever just have the identity of worker. We all have the fullness of humanity. And he was speaking out of the experience of Nazi Germany, of people learning how to press a button, people learning how to make the trains run on time without ever asking where the trains were going or what the button does. And I think that some form of universal encounter with a liberal arts education is absolutely necessary. I'm going to give a very bizarre example. of the kind of inner disposition. We've talked about the philosophic mind or the inner disposition, and how everyone has to have it no matter what their job is in society. This is a story from a while back. So it's before there's internet, before there's cell phones, before there's Uber. So it's a hard story to explain nowadays. So I was on a layover in Newark Airport flying from Houston to London, and I decided that I wanted to get to church. Had a long layover, so I picked up a payphone and asked the operator where the nearest Catholic church was to the Newark Airport. This is how you would do it in the olden days. You'd call the operator. And the operator said, "I'm sorry, I can't tell you that information in that way. The churches are listed in alphabetical order." And then there was a pause, and then she said, "Oh, I go to a Catholic church right near Newark Airport." That's what a liberal education is supposed to enable you to do, right? To step out of your work identity into your human identity, right? And interact with someone as a human being to human being, right? And everyone in society needs that capacity.
Okay, so we have a question in the back.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. So philosopher Tom Sullivan made, I think, a very insightful point some years ago. I think he's probably borrowing from Thomas Aquinas, even though he didn't directly mention it, that you can spend a lot of time in graduate school, for example, reading what so-and-so said, doing like the history aspect, right? But at the end of the day, what perhaps really interests us is really more, is what these figures said true, right? So I think there's a lot to be said, right, doing for like the historical great books approach. But I mean, imagine, for example, if like say like history of philosophy of nature or physics was presented, right? We have like the old theory of caloric along with the newer theory of thermodynamics. A student might walk out and say, "Oh wow, this is interesting. There's a whole ton of disagreement here, right? But who's right? I have no idea." Or they just might pick one at random. Isn't there something to be said, perhaps at least in the systematic courses, right, that you have to ultimately teach what you believe is true, right? And even if you don't do that, sometimes, I mean, students figure out what you believe eventually, right, more or less. So thank you.
It's for you.
So, sorry, I'm going to jump in, but I hope you have something to say on this. I am a great believer in education and a great believer in teachers. I do think that having an established, ordered curriculum is very important. I think that when Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica, he was trying to make an ordered path towards a knowledge of the entirety of the cosmos from first principles. And although no curriculum probably at any of the small liberal arts colleges across America is perfect, because we're all trying to revive liberal education in different ways, I think some attempt at order, some attempt at a curricular structure and order, having an alma mater, having a nourishing mother of the curriculum and professors who are contributing to a unified curriculum is very valuable. And I think the scattershot approach that I myself took when I was an undergraduate is not actually the best, and that for the next generation, we should be looking at colleges that are attempting some form of unified education.
I'm glad you brought that up. There's a very popular fallacy of false opposition between studying the truth of things and studying a tradition or a history or a convention of things. It's not just the case that the question of the truth is what animates and creates the tradition and the history and the conventions, which is true, but it's also the case that everything about the practice of learning, teaching, studying, reflecting, contemplating has truth as its object. And it's not an unattainable object, although it's finally unattainable in its entirety, which is a theological point, but that's another discussion. So the point is, it's a false opposition because, in fact, it's not just that the one, the pursuit of truth, animates the other, the whole Western tradition of inquiry. It's also the case that through the inquiry and through study of the inquiry, truth remains the object and is glimpsed piecemeal and in an assimilative fashion. This is why when Newman talks about this, he talks about the disciplines themselves as interrupting the unified presentation of reality into a separate array of disciplines, artificially and by a process of what he calls mental abstraction, looking at certain facets of experience or reality. And then it's the job, he says, of the philosophic habit of mind to reintegrate, to pull back together into a unified image of complex but integrated reality in our own conception, in our own understanding. He uses in English the word view for this, which is just the Anglo-Saxon for theory. In other words, not unreal, but most real. So what am I saying? Truth is the point, period. I think it was Aquinas. I think the formulation was something like, it is less important to understand what a person has said than it is to understand how the truth of things stands. That's the formulation, I think.
Can I combine this question with the question about universal education, whether everyone should do it? My grandfather finished 9th grade and he had 2 books. The first was the Bible and the second was Hockey Night in Canada. But he was a man of sober judgment. He exercised, if I'm right about the point of the thing, he exercised his freedom responsibly. I'm second to none, I think, in my love of the university. Like, to walk onto a campus is, for me, it still remains one of the great treats of life. Like, there's all this stuff that happens outside of campus. I'm not very good at that, and I don't like it. And then I walk onto campus, and I know who I am and what I'm for, and why would I ever leave this place? Lots of academics are like that, right? We're all sort of horrified at the idea that our own university may go bankrupt because no one will pay us to recite the Adore Te Devote in Latin anywhere else. And we're not good with people. No one really likes us. The temptation for academics is to think that the point of a liberal education is to make other academics. This is something we're guilty of all the time. You're a smart person. You're a wise undergraduate. You should go to graduate school. No, maybe, but not of necessity. You should start a family. You should get a job. You should be a citizen. You should do anything that you need to do to exercise your responsibility and your freedom well. Placing texts in order, there's no ideal framework for that. We're trying to move people from the darkness that they don't understand to the exercise of freedom. It seems to me that every community which is sane will tell the story in its own particular way. That there is, in fact, not the story to be told about the tradition. There is the story about the tradition that's told at Hillsdale and at UD and at Notre Dame and at Boston College and at Brigham Young. And that the sane communities have enough confidence to tell to their young, here are the texts, appropriate your own freedom and your own intellect as you encounter and grapple with these texts. We have a story, it's our community, we have rightful pride in it. It's not the only story, but it is in fact ours. And we're helping you to appropriate your own freedom with the assistance of your friends and teachers. So I do think that you can't just throw the books at them. I also think teachers need to stay out of the way and let them read the texts. And so everything happens through the community's confidence in telling its story and allowing its students to be free to appropriate it for themselves.
So on that note, thank you all for being such excellent teachers of liberal arts tradition. And thank you so much for your excellent remarks. Our next panel will begin at 3 o'clock. Thank you.